First time I noticed the discrepancy, I told myself it was a banking error. The second time, I told myself the same thing. By the third time, I had spent 40 years as a forensic accountant, and I knew with complete certainty that banking errors do not recur at the same intervals in the same amounts, following the same access pattern. I was 78 years old, and my vision had been declining for 2 years, which my daughter-in-law, Patricia, had apparently interpreted as a decline in my entire cognitive and professional capacity. She had been withdrawing money from my savings account for 14 months before I finished compiling the documentation. When I placed it in front of her at my kitchen table that Saturday morning, her expression told me she had not imagined this moment was possible. But to understand what I did after recognizing what was happening, you need to understand the particular kind of clarity that 40 years in forensic accounting provides. When most people discover they are being stolen from, they feel anger first and then confusion about what to do with it. I felt something different, a professional recognition, as precise as any I had experienced in my career, that a pattern was present and that a pattern could be documented. The anger came later, and it was real, but it did not interfere with the work. Understanding how to respond to what Patricia was doing required the same set of skills I had applied to every investigation across 4 decades. The difference was that this time the subject was sitting at my dinner table. Before I continue, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching this from. If you have ever been treated as though your declining eyesight or your age made you an easier target rather than a more experienced one, this story is for you. This community exists for people who understand that experience compounds over decades, and that the most costly mistake anyone can make is to assume that a person who has spent 40 years identifying exactly this kind of behavior will somehow fail to identify it when it is directed at them personally. Now, let me tell you what 40 years of forensic accounting looks like when it is applied at your own kitchen table. My name is Vincent. I am 78 years old. I spent my professional career as a forensic accountant, working first in a regional firm and eventually building my own practice that handled financial investigations for corporations, law firms, and occasionally government agencies. The work required patience, precision, and the ability to construct a complete picture from fragments that individually appeared insignificant. I retired at 72, 3 years after my wife, Margaret, passed. Margaret had been the emotional center of our family for 44 years of marriage. Her absence changed the texture of everything that followed. My son Daniel had married Patricia 6 years before Margaret died. Patricia had always been courteous to Margaret. Her behavior toward me changed after Margaret was no longer present to observe it. My vision began declining at 76, the result of a condition my ophthalmologist described as manageable with treatment but unlikely to improve significantly. I adapted. I used larger print, adjusted my computer settings, and continued reading and managing my affairs without assistance. The adjustments were noticeable to anyone who spent time with me. Patricia spent time with me twice a week, ostensibly to help with shopping and household tasks. I accepted this help because it was offered, and because Daniel asked me to allow it. What I did not do, despite what Patricia apparently assumed, was stop monitoring my financial accounts. A forensic accountant who stops monitoring his accounts because his eyesight has declined is not a forensic accountant who has adapted. He is simply someone who has stopped doing something he should not stop doing. The savings account Patricia was accessing had been built across 40 years of careful management. It represented the accumulated result of decisions made conservatively, investments chosen deliberately, and expenses managed with the discipline of a person who had spent his career watching what happened to people who managed money carelessly. Margaret and I had agreed on the financial approach early in our marriage. We would live on less than we earned, invest the difference patiently, and create a position that would give us genuine security in the years when income from work was no longer reliable. The account balance reflected 4 decades of that discipline. It was not simply a number. It was the concrete form of every decision made correctly across a working life. The house on Birchwood Lane had been our home for 31 years. We had bought it when Daniel was 12 years old, after a decade in a smaller property that had served us well, but had never quite felt like the place we would stay. Birchwood felt permanent from the first viewing. Margaret chose it for the garden, which had a south-facing aspect and room for the varieties she had been trying to grow in containers at our previous house. I chose it because the study was large enough to hold all the reference materials my work required. Over 31 years, the house had accumulated meaning in every room. Managing that house and its contents, including its finances, was something I did myself and intended to continue doing. My professional reputation had been built on a specific combination of thoroughness and discretion. Clients retained me because they knew I would find what was there to find, document it completely, and present it in a form that would withstand scrutiny. The investigations I conducted required me to understand the psychology of financial deception as well as its mechanics, why people believed they would not be caught, how they rationalized what they were doing, and what the moment of exposure typically looked like when it finally arrived. I had sat across from dozens of people at the moment they understood their deception had been completely documented. I had studied those moments professionally for 40 years. I knew exactly what Patricia's expression would look like before I placed the folder on the table. The first discrepancy appeared in month 1 of what I later calculated was a 14-month pattern. The amount was small enough to appear unremarkable to anyone who was not looking carefully. Patricia had access to the household checking account because Daniel had added her as a contact for emergency purposes 2 years earlier with my agreement. She had used that access to transfer a modest amount to an account I did not recognize. When I traced the destination account, it returned no results I could immediately identify. I noted the transaction, flagged it in my records, and continued observing. I did not mention it to Daniel. I did not mention it to Patricia. I simply continued watching the accounts with the same frequency I had always watched them. The second transfer occurred 6 weeks later. Same destination account, a slightly larger amount. The pattern of a 6-week interval would eventually break down as Patricia's confidence increased and her caution decreased. But in the early months, the regularity was itself a form of information. A person who is testing the water takes regular measured steps. They want to know whether each action produces a reaction before taking the next one. Patricia was testing whether I was watching. My absence of visible reaction told her I was not. That conclusion was incorrect, but it was the conclusion her actions were producing, and I was content for it to remain incorrect for as long as it took me to build what I needed. By the 4th month, the transfers were occurring every 4 weeks. The amounts had increased incrementally with each cycle, moving from modest to meaningful in a progression that any forensic accountant would recognize as the standard pattern of someone who has concluded they have found a reliable method. I documented each transaction with the date, amount, and destination account reference. I also began recording something less quantifiable, the changes in Patricia's behavior during her twice-weekly visits. She had become more attentive, more solicitous, more interested in my daily routine and the state of my health. The attention had a quality that I recognized. It was the attention of someone monitoring an asset, not caring for a person. Patricia began asking questions about my estate planning in the 5th month. She framed them as expressions of concern, as practical considerations she wanted to ensure had been thought through. She asked whether my will was current. She asked whether Daniel was named in a way that would avoid complications. She mentioned that a neighbor of hers had experienced difficulty with her late father's estate due to outdated documentation. I answered each question pleasantly and without revealing anything substantive. I told her I had always been careful with these matters, which was accurate. I did not tell her that I had also just completed a full review of every financial document I held and had made several changes that she would not have anticipated based on the impression I was giving her. The amounts Patricia was transferring reached a level in the 8th month that moved from significant to substantial. I had by this point documented more than 40 separate transactions across a span that represented real money by any standard. I had also, through patient research using tools that my professional background made available to me, identified the destination account as belonging to a holding entity that I connected to Patricia through a set of corporate filings that required several evenings of careful analysis to trace completely. The connection was documented, cross-referenced, and supported by records I had obtained through legitimate means. I did not need to guess who was taking the money. I had proof that would have been acceptable in any courtroom I had ever worked in. In the 12th month, Patricia made what she must have believed was a routine visit to help with the weekly shopping. She arrived, made tea, asked about my health, and spent 20 minutes on the computer in my study under the pretense of printing a shopping list. I allowed this as I had allowed it before, because allowing it was part of what I was doing. Before she arrived that morning, I had placed a small device that recorded activity on the device's display. When I reviewed the recording that evening, it showed her navigating to the financial portal and initiating a transfer that was larger than any she had previously made. She had apparently decided that the 12-month absence of any consequence meant she could increase the scale. That decision completed the picture I needed. I called Lewis the following morning. Lewis had been my accountant for 22 years, had worked alongside me on several complex investigations during my practice years, and was one of the few people whose professional judgment I trusted without reservation. I described what I documented without editorial comment, as I would have presented findings to any professional collaborator. Lewis was quiet for a long moment when I finished. He said he could see me Thursday. He arrived that morning with the focus of someone who had been thinking about the conversation since the phone call. He reviewed every document I had prepared. When he finished, he said the documentation was complete and the pattern was unambiguous. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to do it correctly. Lewis recommended a private investigator named Samir, whom he had worked with on 2 prior matters involving financial irregularities with a family dimension. Samir was recommended specifically because his approach was methodical and his documentation was consistently prepared to a legal standard. I met Samir at Lewis's office and explained the situation from the beginning. Samir reviewed my documentation and then asked several questions about Patricia's access patterns, her schedule, and the degree to which she was currently aware that her actions had been observed. I told him she appeared entirely unaware. He said that was useful. Over the following 3 weeks, Samir conducted additional verification work that confirmed the connection between the destination account and Patricia and added several layers of documentation to what I had already assembled. My lawyer, Eleanor, had handled my affairs for 16 years. I described the complete situation in a meeting that lasted 3 hours. Eleanor was thorough and precise and asked questions that clarified every element of what I had and what I still needed. She confirmed that the documentation Lewis and I had assembled, supplemented by Samir's verification work, was sufficient to support a legal claim of financial elder abuse under the applicable statutes. She also outlined the alternatives: formal legal action, a private confrontation with a binding agreement, or a combination of both depending on how the initial confrontation proceeded. I told her I preferred the private confrontation with full legal preparation in place, because I wanted Patricia to understand the complete extent of what I had documented before she made any choices about how to respond. The 3 weeks following my meeting with Eleanor were the ones I found most demanding. Patricia continued her visits. She continued her questions about my health and my plans. She brought shopping and made tea and sat in my kitchen with the comfortable manner of someone who believes they have correctly assessed a situation. I answered pleasantly and asked questions about Daniel and their life and said nothing that would have alerted her to what was being prepared. I had spent my career maintaining composure in situations that required concealing knowledge while continuing to function normally in front of people who did not know I had it. That skill was not something I had lost. If anything, the personal dimension of the situation sharpened. I chose a Saturday for the confrontation because Daniel would be away for a weekend conference and Patricia had a standing arrangement to stop by and check on me. Eleanor had prepared a full settlement agreement that required Patricia to acknowledge the specific transactions, agree to complete restitution according to a documented schedule, and accept terms that would govern any future access to my household. Samir had provided a final verification report. Lewis had prepared a comprehensive financial summary cross-referencing every transaction with its date, amount, and documentary source. I placed these materials in a folder on the kitchen table the morning before Patricia arrived. I made tea. I sat down. I waited. When I heard her key in the door, I was entirely ready. Patricia came in with the practiced ease of 14 months of successful deception. She asked how I was feeling. I told her I was feeling very well, which was entirely true. I invited her to sit down. She sat across from me with her tea. I said I had prepared something I wanted to share with her, and I placed the folder on the table between us. I told her it contained a complete financial analysis of 14 months of transactions from my savings account to an account she controlled, verified by my accountant and a private investigator, and reviewed by my lawyer, who had also prepared the settlement agreement at the back of the folder. I told her she should take whatever time she needed to read it. Patricia read the folder in silence. It took 22 minutes. I know because I noted the time when she opened it. She did not look up until she reached the settlement agreement. The expression she had when she looked up was the one I had predicted based on 4 decades of sitting across from people in that specific moment. There was the initial attempt at denial forming behind the eyes, and then the recognition that the documentation made denial professionally untenable. And then a stillness that replaced both as the full extent of what was in front of her became clear. I told her she could call her own lawyer before responding if she preferred. She said nothing for a long time. Then she asked if Daniel knew. I told her this conversation was happening before any other conversation. The settlement discussion lasted 2 hours. Eleanor had anticipated most of the responses Patricia offered and had prepared language that addressed each of them in the agreement's terms. Patricia attempted twice to reframe what she had done as something that had been misunderstood. Both times I referred her to specific entries in the Lewis summary, which addressed each transaction with a level of detail that left the reframing without foundation. By the end of the first hour, we were no longer discussing what had occurred. We were discussing the terms under which it would be resolved. Patricia's position throughout was that of someone who had understood, about 40 minutes into the meeting, that she was not in a negotiation about whether the documentation was accurate. She was in a conversation about what happened next. Patricia signed the settlement agreement before leaving my kitchen that Saturday. The agreement required full restitution and a payment schedule Eleanor had designed to be achievable without producing additional financial pressure that could complicate compliance. It required Patricia to acknowledge in writing that she had conducted the transactions without authorization. It included provisions about future access to my financial accounts and household systems. It also contained a clause that Eleanor had suggested and I had approved, a complete written account of how and when Patricia had first made the decision to begin taking the money. I had required this not for legal purposes, but because I wanted to understand the reasoning. When I read the account she provided 2 weeks later, its contents were exactly what 40 years of professional experience had prepared me to expect. In the weeks before that Saturday, Patricia had shown no sign of awareness that her actions had been documented. Her visits had continued on their regular schedule. Her manner had been unchanged. She had, during one visit, mentioned casually that she had found a very helpful financial advisor she thought I might benefit from meeting, which I had declined politely. She had, during another, suggested that managing my accounts with more assistance might reduce the mental burden of keeping track of everything. I had told her I found the management of my accounts neither burdensome nor difficult. She had nodded and moved on to another subject. She had, in 14 months, not once behaved like a person who believed discovery was possible. That confidence was not unreasonable given her assessment of my situation. Her assessment had been wrong. Daniel had not been part of what Patricia was doing. I was confident of this from the beginning of my analysis, and Samir's investigation confirmed it. Daniel's unawareness was both evident in his behavior toward me and documented by Samir's work. When I spoke to Daniel after the settlement was signed, his response was the one I had expected from a man who had genuinely not known. Disbelief first, then the specific kind of distress that comes from discovering that someone you trusted entirely has been conducting a deception that implicated you without your knowledge. He asked why I had not told him immediately when I first noticed the pattern. I told him I had needed to complete the documentation before any confrontation occurred, because confronting without documentation produces denial rather than accountability. The restitution was completed according to the payment schedule in the agreement. Eleanor monitored compliance. Each payment arrived on its scheduled date. I did not speak to Patricia directly during the restitution period. Correspondence passed through Eleanor's office. Daniel called regularly, and our conversations were honest in the particular way of conversations between people who have moved through a difficult situation together and are still processing what it means. He asked questions, I answered directly. I asked questions, he answered the same way. He told me he was reviewing the arrangements in his life and the people who were part of them. I told him I thought that was wise. I told him I did not consider what had happened a reflection on him. He said he was not sure he agreed with that, and I respected his reasoning. The conversation I found most significant in the months following was not with Daniel or Patricia. It was with Louis, over lunch at the same restaurant where we had met to review my initial documentation. Louis had handled the financial side of several difficult investigations in his career. He asked me whether the professional discipline had made the personal dimension easier or harder to manage. I told him it had made it easier to execute and harder to absorb. He said that sounded about right. We ate in a comfortable silence that had the quality of understanding shared between two people who have spent their careers seeing things that other people prefer not to know about. The professional had protected me through the process. What came after was mine to manage alone. Patricia and Daniel's relationship changed substantially after that Saturday. I was not the cause of those changes, and I had no interest in directing them. I had done what the situation required, and the results of the settlement had been achieved. What happened in their marriage afterward was a matter for two adults to work out without my involvement. I continued my life in the house on Birchwood Lane. I continued managing my own accounts, my reading, my occasional consultation work for former colleagues who still valued my judgment on specific cases. I walked in the garden Margaret had planted. I read in the evenings. I existed in my own house with my own history, exactly as I had been doing before Patricia decided that my declining vision was an invitation she could act on. What I did required nothing I had not learned in 40 years of professional practice. It required patience, documentation, and a willingness to complete the work before taking any action that would alert the subject. These are the same requirements every investigation I had ever conducted had placed on me. The difference was that the subject was not a corporate treasurer or a financial manager at a client organization. The subject was a person who sat in my kitchen twice a week and made me tea while transferring my savings to an account she controlled. The professional skills applied equally. The professional distance required somewhat more effort to maintain than it would have in a client matter. But the result was the same result I had produced in every case where the documentation was complete and the preparation was thorough. The thing I return to most often when I think about those 14 months is not the money. It is the assumption. Patricia had decided that my declining eyesight meant my professional capacity had declined proportionally, that the specific skills that had been my livelihood and my identity for 4 decades had somehow departed with the sharpness of my vision. That assumption was the error from which all the others followed. I understand how someone makes that assumption. I have seen it made about elderly people with some regularity throughout my career. What I had not experienced before was having it made about me specifically by someone sitting at my own table. Understanding it professionally was one thing. Being its object and then documenting it completely was something I did not expect to be among the significant experiences of my late 70s. The documentation is filed with Eleanor's office and will remain there. The settlement is complete and the terms have been honored. I am 78 years old and I manage my own affairs with the same precision I have always brought to that task. My vision continues to decline at the rate my doctor predicted, and I continue to adapt. The adaptations do not extend to my financial monitoring. That monitoring has not been relaxed and will not be. I know from 40 years of professional experience what patterns look like when they are present and what they cost when they are not caught. Mine was caught because I was paying attention. Before you go, I want to ask you one question. If someone close to you had been taking from you for over a year, believing your limitations made you unaware, what would you have done when you discovered it? Tell me in the comments below.